I'm going to start with something that seems unusual to kick off a talk on medicine, and that is space. Why am I doing this? Well, we're talking here, we're spending time together to discuss ways to leapfrog Africa and to bypass conventional technologies. Well, Africa shares something in common with space. What you see here is astronaut Tim Peake from the European Space Agency, and here's another shot of Sunitha Williams from NASA. Does anybody know what they're actually doing to themselves? It kind of looks like they're heroin addicts, but what they're actually doing is tourniqueting themselves in microgravity and sticking a needle into their veins in order to collect blood to do scientific and medical experiments on board station. Now, space presents a really, really unique opportunity for study. It is remote. We have very little access to the expertise we have on Earth. We have very little access to personnel, to equipment. Now, you can see here a digital ultrasound and stethoscope being used on another astronaut. And it's a very similar problem that we deal with in rural areas: lack of expertise and lack of supplies. If you look at this graph, actually, it shows that in South Africa, there's less than one physician per 1,000 people. So the question is, rather than just constantly training up new physicians, how are we going to actually fill this gap? Well, I'm part of a consortium, actually, that tried to figure out ways to deliver critical care surgery and anesthesia in space. And Dr. Komorowski and I, two anesthesiologists, developed a protocol that we could actually use to train personnel who were in a Mars simulation in real time, and we actually connected between Silicon Valley, France, and the Concordia Antarctica base, all at the same time, in order to train people who are actually performing a rescue mission. Now, that's a form of telehealth, if you think about it, and telehealth is really becoming an important way of bringing expertise to places where they're actually lacking access to medical expertise. And telehealth can be delivered through personnel interacting with you on screens, can be delivered through smartphone devices, which are almost ubiquitous in Africa, and it can also be delivered through robots. But what's really, really missing here, and what I've been telling you, is supply chain. A 2010 study by Harvard actually showed that almost 2 billion people on the planet don't actually get access to very simple but life-saving surgery because they either can't get access to a sterile operating room or there aren't sterile surgical tools available. Now, that's a real tragedy. But let's go back to space. Now, this is a company that actually came out of Singularity. It's called Made in Space. And what did they have the idea to do? To take a pre-existing technology that's just on the knee of its exponential acceleration curve, which is a 3D printer. And they thought to launch that to the station in order to actually build the tools that they might need on board. And one of the things you might be able to print are surgical instruments. Surgical instruments, if you've got the CAD file, are actually very, very easy to put together and print on a printer. And if you ever thought, well, you know, what about the energy consumption requirements? Well, the plastic parts cost very little. And the first solar-powered 3D printers are now coming online. So there is a company founded by a friend of mine, Dara Dotz. She lives in San Francisco. And her company, Field Ready, is actually taking 3D printers into the field, into remote areas, in order to actually provide the ability to fill in supply chain gaps for places that need it. Now, these are 3D printers delivered to Haiti after the earthquake. And what you can see is that there are local people who are actually being trained on how to develop CAD files and actually print what they're missing and what they need. And one of the items that they needed very badly, how many people have been in a delivery room? This is an umbilical cord clamp. They were missing umbilical cord clamps. This clamp only costs about a nickel to print. However, if they had actually had to get a full supply shipment, they would have had to order tens of thousands of these from China at a cost of thousands of dollars. Here's another example. This is actually an asthma machine, a nebulizer that was actually missing parts, and you can see in red the 3D printed parts that were used to repair it. Another example was a baby incubator for premature newborns that the clamp was missing and broken. They couldn't get the missing part. They were able to scan it, develop a CAD file, and here you can see Dara trying to print this on a 3D printer, and the outcome is what you see in red. They were able to basically rehabilitate all of their incubators by printing a very simple part on a 3D printer. So what I'm trying to say to you is that leapfrogging medical technology is going to take a massive paradigm shift. Now, Africa is doing very well in certain areas. It's actually been leapfrogging in terms of energy, actually ocean exploration, and recently one of South Africa's teams actually entered the semifinals for an X Prize on education. But in terms of healthcare, this is the average investment for all OECD nations, and you can see right now that South Africa lags behind the world average. So we need to find ways to increase investment in this type of technology. So I'm going to take you on a whirlwind tour of some of these technologies. We started a bit with 3D printing, and I told you about 3D printing to bypass issues with supply chain. So let's now combine 3D printing with stem cell technology. The holy grail here is to actually print organs for humans. We have a massive, massive shortage of organs for transplant. Now, that's a hard goal to hit right away, but we can make tiny baby steps in between. Now, what you see here is an Australian biopen, and what these researchers have done is taken induced pluripotent adult stem cells. Somebody asked a question here about what you can do with adults. You take stem cells, you bring them back to their sort of nascent, their state of being able to become almost anything. And now these cells can become expressed as cartilage. Take a patient who has arthritis or who needs a knee replacement, and now you can use this pen, which can actually print stem cells that turn into cartilage that are cross-linked by UV light that is shown every time a cell is laid down. And they can literally just paint cartilage into someone's knee. Okay, so that's a major advance on the way. Now again, organs, how do we get there? Well, here's a Japanese company that's actually using a robot with 6 degrees of freedom to print a 3D model of a heart valve. How many people here who know someone who's actually had a valve replacement? Okay, there's a lot of hands in the audience. This is actually a very difficult operation to do, and in addition, it's difficult to, right now, most of our valves are either artificial or they're actually taken from pigs. But what if you could use a patient's own stem cells to print the exact heart valve that they needed for replacement? There are a lot of nations getting involved with this. This is an Israeli company that was actually originally a 3D printing company that's trying to get into the game for 3D printing of organs. This is a Japanese company trying to do the same. And they've also had success in 3D printing stem cells. And here you can actually see heart tissue that they developed, that they were able to 3D print. And if you can see, the heart tissue is actually beating like a real human heart. So not to be outdone, actually in the United States there are a couple of groups. This one is at Wake Forest. They're actually printing molds now to create things like kidneys, human bladders, and even ears, eyeballs. So we're starting with some small organs. And actually, 4 years ago, a gentleman who needed surgery in the UK, who had actually lost a lot of his face, had a 3D scan done, and part of his face was replaced by 3D printing of reconstructed materials for his face. So let's move on to microfluidics. What is microfluidics? Well, basically, this is the idea that you can take a small chip And you could run very small, minute quantities of fluid across that chip, but those fluids can have very special properties that mimic either cells or organs. Here's an example of an institute over at Harvard that specializes in microfluidic chips and design. And here's a lung on a chip. So these are the alveoli, the little sacs that are beating and pulsing that exchange air in each of your lungs. What this chip actually does is it has a membrane that actually mimics those air sacs, and those membrane is actually surrounded by 2 microfluidic layers that allow blood to pass. And then you see these vacuum channels that actually pulse and cause those alveoli to beat. And in doing so, you can actually test pathogens and microbes in the lung or drug delivery. And not to be outdone, they're now trying to create organs on a chip for all sorts of organs. You can see lungs, heart, kidney, bladders, knees. And then there's the idea of actually creating entire laboratories on chips. So you have entire human bodies and laboratories where you can actually do drug development, drug testing, and drug design. This is a way to actually leapfrog the whole process of drug discovery, which if any of you are actually in the pharma industry know can take up to 10 years and billions of dollars for development. And finally, you actually saw a reference to this. We can actually use microfluidics to diagnose disease. Here's an example of Microliths actually using blood tests to detect cancer. So let's move on now to robotics. Now, how many of you are familiar with robotic surgery? Some people, again. It turns out robotic surgery is not a future thing. We actually do robotic surgery in the OR about 20% of the time to replace laparoscopic surgery. So I spend a lot of time in the OR delivering anesthesia for these kinds of cases. But robots can be used in all sorts of interesting ways. This is actually to replace the hands of a surgeon. But we can use robots in ways that actually assist humans. So this is a robot in Japan that's actually being used to lift a patient and put her on a bed. Here's another robot that's being actually used to assist a person so that they can lift and turn people without injury. And here you actually see a robot that's actually being used to do yoga and remedial sort of movement therapy for people who are elderly in a home. So this robot is actually like waving its arms, and the people are actually following the robot. So let's go a little bit into regenerative medicine. A stem cell is something that when you are a fetus has the ability to turn into many, many kinds of organs. There's been a lot of controversy for a long time over using stem cells to solve a lot of diseases, for instance, Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's. Why? Because the most obvious source of stem cells was a fetus. But we can now take adult, mature cells, for instance, from your skin or from the fat, and we can actually revert them to a more immature state so they can become anything we want them to be. And one thing that you can actually do with that is use this to give therapy back to people so they don't actually reject the transplant. Another really interesting thing you can do is personalized medicine in a dish. Let's say you take a person who has a point mutation, and you take and extract their cells. You can put them and grow them up in a dish, actually repair them using CRISPR, and give this back to the patient. You could also use those same cells to screen for drugs that might be specific to working for that patient. So for instance, let's just take a very simple example, high blood pressure. There are lots of classes of high blood pressure medications on the market. And most of the time as physicians, when we prescribe them, they don't work for the people that we prescribe them for. And it takes us months for them to come back into the clinic, for us to try them again, change the class of drug, change the doses, and try and figure out what might work. But when you can actually grow up cells in a dish and test them before the patient even takes the drug, it completely changes the landscape. Now, here's an example of using induced pluripotent stem cells to study a patient with a type of heart disease called cardiomyopathy. This was done at Stanford. And what you can actually see is when you grow up these cells, the two pictures at the top in red and green are examples of what normal patients look like. And they're really, really stereotyped patterns. In fact, the one in green almost looks like a tree with concentric rings. But when you take a patient with cardiomyopathy and you grow up their cells in a dish, what you actually find is the proteins are completely disordered. And if you now grow them up using induced pluripotent stem cell technology, what you can see here is this cluster of heart cells now beating in a dish, and you can see that the cells are not beating together in time like a person who doesn't have this disease. Now you can begin the drug screening process. So this opens up a whole new way of doing precision medicine and actually contributing to precision health. Now we can take some of this stem cell technology and do something else very interesting with it. This company, BioQuark, has been interested in the idea of using stem cells to reset all sorts of human diseases. This is an example of a salamander. This salamander is an adult organism that's actually lost a limb. And what you see here in this time lapse is that salamander regrowing its limb. Now, we do this as fetuses all the time. Human beings have this ability to regrow organs in utero. But typically after we're born, that doesn't happen. By the way, if you cut your little baby finger off up till the age of about 2 months, did you know you could actually regrow your pinky? So we actually retain some salamander-like qualities, but they go away pretty soon. I would not try this experiment at home. But the idea is, if we could recreate that entire chemical milieu in which salamanders can regrow limbs, what else could we regrow? So BioQuark was asking that question, so they founded this company called Reanima. Of all the organs one might want to regrow, has anybody ever thought about regrowing their brain? I know, it's a little freaky, all right? But for those of you out there who are into the idea of either prolonging your life or actually coming back to life through cryonic preservation, you want your brain to come back intact. So what they're trying to do is reverse brain death. That sounds weird and spooky and very science fiction-like. They have actually filed on clinicaltrials.gov with the NIH a clinical trial to take a group of patients in an Indian hospital who are on a ventilator and who have been pronounced brain dead and try to reanimate their brains. And I am not kidding you. This was filed last year. Now, this does bring up some ethical questions. Informed consent is one of them. But we should think about these things because they're coming down the pike. Remember I talked about cryogenic preservation? There are actually insurance companies in the United States that are now offering this and offering you the idea of preserving your body in a vat. But I can assure you none of you would want to do that if you came back and your brain was full of ice crystals and you were a vegetable. So let's go now to gene editing. There's been a lot of interest in gene editing in this audience, as there should be. So CRISPR-Cas9, cutting out and editing pieces of DNA that have gone bad. Well, the first applications of this actually in adults, not in embryos, but in adults, was actually done on mice at the Salk Institute. And it turns out that a group of researchers there was actually able to partially restore light sensitivity in mice that had lost their vision due to genetic defects. Now, soon on the heels of that, we've actually had companies like George Church's, which, I don't know, they decided that they might want to found a company to, let's say, grow organs again. Organ shortage is a big thing. But what's the #1 problem with this? Well, taking an organ that's been grown up in another animal often can introduce lethal viruses that are not unique to the pigs in which we grow these organs, but they are unique to humans, and they can actually kill the recipient. So just a few weeks ago, the first editing was successfully done in the embryos of these actual pigs to produce little piglets, actually. This was at Oregon Health Sciences University. And what they were able to do was actually edit out the sequences of these ancient viruses that affected pigs but did nothing to them but would kill humans. So the idea now that we could grow up human organs, potentially using human-induced pluripotent stem cells in other animals, might become a reality. Raymond referenced this study, just came out a few days ago. Same place, Oregon Health Sciences University. They are the first ones to correct a gene that codes for cardiomyopathy. Do you remember that funny set of beating cells I showed you in a dish? It's a very similar problem, and they were able to correct this in embryos. Now, what's even more interesting about this, and something to keep in mind, they didn't just edit embryos, they edited embryos or the cells within the DNA within the germline, which means that this genetic defect, which you would normally pass on to your children, is now corrected forever after in all of your progeny. And that's a huge, huge advance. Now, we've been using gene editing techniques to do some really interesting things in neuroscience for a long time. This is actually, this technology was developed in a lab that I did my postdoctoral work in, Carl Deiserat's lab at Stanford. Another major player in this is Ed Boyden's lab at MIT. And the idea here is you take these tiny little microbes which phototax to light, which means if they sense light, they move to it. And what was done is the pieces of the DNA that allowed these little microbes, these unicellular organisms, to respond to light and open up ion channels that would let them move, those channels were cut out, put into the DNA of viruses, and used to infect neurons or nerve cells in the brain. And we can now activate nerve cells in the brain using pulses of light. Now, the problem with this technology, which is called optogenetics, is you normally have to implant an electrode or a fiber optic into the brain permanently. But what if you want to use something non-invasive? Well, then what you do is put a pressure-sensitive channel using the same technology. In this one, a pressure-sensitive channel was put into the motor neuron of a worm. And that worm was hit with an ultrasound. You'll see that happening up there on the screen. And the neurons being hit with ultrasound, sound waves, and that worm is now changing direction. So we can now use genetics to infect human nerve cells to allow them to be manipulated from the outside of our brains to do things. Finally, we're sequencing entire genomes. Now, what happens if, in the process of sequencing genomes, we detect errors like this? Are we going to get to the point where we're going to allow people to actually come in and actually start editing the germline of their embryos? I want a child who's an athlete. I want a child with a certain eye color, with a certain IQ. So this brings up a lot of ethical issues that we need to deal with. So let's move into bionics, and you're going to begin to see how all these different topics weave and overlap. With bionics, what you see here is a 3D printed myoprosthetic hand. It was printed for pennies on the dollar compared to what we used to build in terms of bionics. This would normally cost about $50,000 to build. On a 3D printer, it's a few $100s. A myoprosthetic can actually link up to the muscles, myo, and we can begin to now innervate these 3D printed devices to move them and integrate them with muscle controlled with thought. Bionics has gotten so sophisticated in terms of the biomechanics. I'm going to show you a video. This gentleman up here, has anybody ever seen him before? Any hands? We've got at least a few. This is Hugh Hare. He's a professor at MIT. When he was a young kid, actually less than 20 years old, he was really an avid rock climber, and he lost both of his limbs in a climbing accident. Now, for most kids, that would throw them into depression, but he just decided to fix the problem. So the first thing he did is he went down to Radio Shack, back in the days when there were Radio Shacks, and he started to create and build parts that he could actually attach to his stumps to allow him to climb again. And what you're going to see here is an excerpt of his TED Talk that I wanted to show you to show how advanced bionics has become. What he did was he built a set of limbs that were unique for a woman who was a dancer who had her limbs blown off during a terrorist attack. This was during the Boston Marathon. And this is what you're going to see here. This has sound.
Allow me to introduce Adrienne Hoslett-Davis, her first performance since the attack. She's dancing with Christian Leitner.
I thought that was actually pretty amazing. If you look at the biomechanics of that, it's absolutely gorgeous. And imagine now what that's going to mean for people who have lost limbs in wars or through other issues like neurological diseases. Well, this whole new field of bionics and integrating bionics and exoskeletons with humans has become so prevalent that last year in 2016 was the first basically Olympics for people who were disabled but who had basically bionic or other electronic enhancements. So that would have been the world's first cyborg games. And I want to show you an example of how this technology has taken us non-invasively into the future. What you see here is a paraplegic. He basically can't move his legs. And the scientist who's been working with him is someone named Miguel Nicolelis, a Brazilian neuroscientist who now works at Duke in the United States. And what they do is they've built these lower body exoskeletons for paraplegics. These exoskeletons aren't connected to computers. They're actually receiving brain waves that are being picked up from an electroencephalogram, an EEG, that's attached to their head under this helmet. And so what happens is these people who can't move their legs imagine moving them. The EEG signals are picked up, they're decoded through algorithms that have been developed and refined over the years, and that information is sent out to the bionic legs. Those legs now begin to move, and they not only begin to move, they provide haptic feedback so the person actually feels like they're walking again. And on top of it, these people are immersed in augmented and virtual reality to help their training. And the end result is this.
Juliano Pinto helped make the start of the 2014 FIFA World Cup Brazil unforgettable. The 29-year-old paraplegic man successfully made the first kick at Arena Corinthians in Sao Paulo. Pinto wore a full-body robotic suit to help him kick the ball. The brain-controlled exoskeleton was created by the Walk Again Project, an international collaborative effort involving 150 researchers led by Brazilian neuroscientist Dr. Miguel Nicolelis, now based at Duke University. The first step in controlling the suit is easy. The wearer simply has to think about moving. From there, the process gets a little complicated. Nicolelis details it best, saying the human thoughts are detected by sensors and sent to a computer which interprets this information and sends info to the exoskeleton. It allows the patient to control movements on the lower limbs. That's the first innovation. The final aspect is for the exoskeleton to demonstrate the movement. Hydraulic drivers on the suit moved Pinto's legs, which allowed him to feel the vibrations of walking. In layman's terms, that means he felt the sensations of real movement rather than feeling as though he was being carried by a robot. Those who witnessed Pinto's kick firsthand got to see what life can hopefully be like for paraplegics in the future.
So here's the most amazing part. That was already amazing enough. They actually did a follow-up study for neurorehabilitation with 20 of those patients. All 20 of them regained some neurological function. So these people have spinal cord injuries, and in the process of imagining that they were walking, in the process of getting feedback from their legs to their brains that they were indeed walking, immersing themselves in virtual reality, their brains just said, oh, we're whole, and fixed them. So neurorehabilitation without surgery, regrown, neural connections without surgery. And that, to me, was one of the most amazing outcomes of this. So bringing this full circle into the place that this is going is the idea of brain-machine interfaces. What you see here is a picture of the cortex. This is basically a piece of your skull that's cut away, and that's brain tissue underneath. And what you see are a grid of electrodes lying on top. And we do this often in the operating room for deep brain stimulation, for epilepsy surgeries. But in fact, these kinds of electrodes, if they're put in the right place, can actually interpret people's thoughts and help them to move. Here's another example that's a little bit less invasive being developed in Berkeley. So this is basically a piezoelectric device, which means that this is a device that can convert electrical signals into pressure or sound waves, and vice versa. Right now, these are smaller than about a half of the tip of my pinky finger. They are planning on miniaturizing these devices into the size of grains of sand, and they can sprinkle this throughout your nervous system, on your nerves, in order to read what your nerves and your brain are intending and to rewrite and rewire that neural code. And hence, then there's an entire new field that has been born. Not pharmaceuticals, but electroceuticals. Another example of actually translating this is the idea of this is sensory substitution. This is for people who are blind. What you see is a device here that was developed in Wisconsin and turned into another company called Brainport. These are glasses that have a camera attached to the front. Now you have a person who has lost their sight, but the camera is actually able to get an image. And what you can see here is it's turning the image into a grayscale depiction with these pixels. And you see that white paddle that comes out? That paddle's a tongue display unit. It sits on your tongue and actually sends signals back to your brain. And so what happens is you end up tasting the world. It feels like little champagne bubbles on the tongue. And here's an example of what this is like for a blind person.
Your brain is what really sees, not your eyes. If your eyes don't work, and you can create another portal into the brain, then your brain is what is going to interpret the world around you.
Brainport is essentially a camera that translates a video image to a plate that I wear in my mouth.
Dad.
Hundreds of pixels on the plate tingle on my tongue, and together they form patterns and shapes that my brain interprets as the space around me.
The information's the same whether you collect it from your eyes or from our cameras with a tongue display. He knows a lot about his environment already through the sense of sound and touch, and this adds one more piece to the puzzle.
I think it's amazing.
I can see it, I just can't grab it.
This is the best part. He's climbing a rock wall with his sense of taste. He can't see.
Good job.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it? So we can use sensory substitution. We can implant devices now to make up for the senses we've lost. This one on the left has actually been FDA approved in the United States, and the one on the right in Europe. But the true brilliance of brain-machine interfaces is actually seen here in this next video. And you can see this implanted array of electrodes that's implanted into the premotor cortex. That's the area that actually interprets your thoughts when you think you want to move. And this gentleman, he's not a paraplegic, he's a quadriplegic. He's lost all sensation from the neck down. And yet, what you're about to see on the screen is he is going to use his thoughts to open email, to use a mouse, and to type on a keyboard. Using his thoughts. By the way, Facebook is all over this. They're trying to do this. They just announced at their last conference. They're trying to do this with non-invasive technology. Now, here's an example of a woman using her thoughts to drive a robotic arm to bring a water bottle to her lips. all done by thought alone. No computers in between. So we're using robotics and brain-machine interfaces to give life back to people who have actually lost function. This is a specialized robotic arm developed at the University of Pittsburgh that allows people who are amputees to also control the arm with their thoughts and to get sensation back. So this gentleman actually felt President Obama's hand as he shook it. So I'm going to close with this, artificial intelligence. I know you had an entire talk on this yesterday with Vivian Ming. Artificial intelligence is not just used for games, but it's been used in medicine now for things like drug discovery. You can use artificial intelligence to actually move through matching patterns and templates to find drugs that can actually bind to things like the Ebola virus, or for patients with multiple sclerosis that we couldn't have possibly have hoped to do by ourselves before this. You can also use it in remote areas, bringing this back full circle. If you combine an AI with something like a smartphone, you can actually use this to do things like diagnose cervical cancer in remote parts of the world where there isn't enough medical expertise there. The most interesting, however, is that there are companies that have decided that rather than just sort of sit back and watch the machines evolve, we are now going to enhance humans and watch them evolve. So this first company, Kernel, founded by Brian Johnson in LA, was actually developed in 2016. And their idea was to use the same implants I showed you, invasive electrode arrays on human brains, in order to enhance their ability to learn and remember things. And of course, just a couple of months ago, Elon Musk announced the same thing. So now he's throwing all his muscle behind what I wonder if it's going to be his final company. I mean, he's already conquered space and energy. To actually see if we can not only solve the problem of human intelligence, but actually link us to neural networks. In order to, just imagine this for 1 second. We are not just talking about solving problems of disease. Imagine we could take human brains and link them to the internet. Imagine we could take human brains and link them to other human brains. What about animal brains? How would that change intelligence? How would that change empathy? Would that allow you to eventually upload your consciousness into a computer? So, as you think about everything I've presented, go back to consider the issues of access. Issues of access, are we going to do this by delivering things door to door? Are we going to use exponential technologies like drone delivery? Or are we going to use local wearable devices that can now enhance human health at the individual level? Consider also ethics, right? I'm sure a lot of you are sitting here with the ethical dilemmas this is bringing up. All those beautiful exoskeletons I showed you, of course the military's trying them. This is a failed exoskeleton used by the US military, but they're all over this research. And the militaries of every country are working on building super soldiers. We can now engineer human embryos. Last time I gave this talk, we actually couldn't. We now can. All right, so every week this technology is changing. And what does that mean? Not only for the ethics of creating human embryos, but are we going to be creating a new race of haves and have-nots? Do you need money to do this? So if you have a lot of money, do you get to build the baby you want? And if you don't have money, you're stuck with what you inherited? Is it going to be like that film Gattaca? I never even told you about this. We can already do this using optogenetics. We can implant false memories of fear. So what if we started to do that because we now know how to read and rewire brains? And then what about the issue of data and privacy? We haven't even talked about that. Lawyers are trying to use brain imaging to actually incriminate people on the stand. But if you're implanting false memories, what does that mean? This just came out a couple of months ago. For the first time, hackers were able to actually detect what your password was by non-invasively looking at your brain waves. Your pacemakers, this is an old technology. What if you can hack pacemakers? We know we can hack Jeeps. We can hack pacemakers. What if you wanted to do harm to somebody? You hacked the electrical system of a pacemaker and caused it to fire and killed somebody. You could do this with an insulin pump, too. And finally, AI is becoming so sophisticated that we can use it for all sorts of nefarious reasons. And when you combine that with things like brain imaging and reading people's brain signals and being able to rewire their brains at a distance, we have a big ethical problem on our hands. I mentioned supply chain to you. There are really innovative ways of using local supply chain. This is a company that develops feminine pads by using banana leaves in local villages and gives the money back to the women working there. What about the future of jobs? Robots taking our jobs. I had a conversation with my driver last night. He was worried about driverless cars taking over his job. I said to him, I'm a physician. I'm certain robots plus AIs are going to take over my job. I used to think that that might not be true. I am absolutely convinced that physicians are going to be completely disrupted. And the only thing that we will be good for at this point is actually delivering empathetic care to other humans. Our knowledge and our skills are going to become completely valueless in the face of machines and artificial intelligence. But robots can do good. This is a robot companion in Japan. These are robots acting as doctors. And in the end, it's all going to come down to education. And in every country, if we can provide more education, we will be able to deal with the ethical implications of these exploding technologies. And my understanding is many of you out there are investors, so I want to leave you with the idea that you should be investing and putting your money in this sector. And you can put it in technologies that are not, they're adjacent to the sector. They don't have to be directly in healthcare. But I want every one of you to think about how you can help Africa leapfrog its healthcare sector into the future for the sake of individuals, for the sake of community, and maybe Africa will become the leader for the entire planet. Thank you.